Dr. John Patrick Riley, and this is the Civil War on Paper, Episode 4, where we take a look at the Schenectady Democrat and Reflectors issue for August 15th, 1861. And we are back after a little bit of a pause. Did not intend for it to be this long of a pause, but life got busy, but I'm really excited to be starting up again. So 161 years ago today, we have news about the Battle of Wilson's Creek, rumor of an Irishman's rhinectomy by Minneball. Local merchant channels Andrew Jackson in order to advertise his unbeatable savings, and we get news from abroad. There's actually a lot in this week's paper that I would love to cover, including news about elections in Tennessee, commentary on the Crittenden Compromise, and so forth. But I only have so much time, so here we go. A miscellaneous note reads, "Narrow escape. During the late battle, a bullet wounded the tip of Thomas Francis Marr's nose and cut off a portion of his mustache." That struck me as odd, as I've never read anything about him having a wound like that. And after looking into it a bit more, it does not seem to be accurate. Marr was wounded at Bull Run, but not in the face in the manner described. Thomas Francis Marr was an avid recruiter of Irishmen to the U.S.'s cause. After recruiting a company of 100 Irish-descended New Yorkers, he and his men were made part of the 69th New York Militia, which was called into federal service and sent to D.C. in April. They took part in the Battle of Bull Run. There it is. I have... no, I don't. What was I thinking? Thought I had a picture of it. Nope. Just Francis Marr. So they took part in the Battle of Bull Run. During the battle, Marr's horse is shot out from under him, and the fall knocks him unconscious. So the 69th had been part of General Sherman's brigade, and they are part of the efforts to recapture artillery that had been taken by the 33rd Virginia. They don't succeed and instead end up forming part of the rear guard, but they find themselves swamped by other federal units that are streaming off the field. And in the confusion, Marr gets left behind. Well, he is apparently located and rescued by members of the 2nd U.S. Dragoons, and since he's still a bit shaken from his fall, he hitches a ride on an artillery caisson. That caisson, while crossing Bull Run, has a horse killed and tips, which pitches him into the stream. He had to swim on his own to the far side, where he eventually rejoined his men. But the 69th New York at Bull Run lost their colonel, who was captured trying to rally units that were overwhelming the Army's rear guard. Their lieutenant colonel, who was killed in action, along with 37 men killed and another 59 wounded, and some 95 missing. Their enlistment in federal service expired 4 days later, and was part of the reason why so many units, once the battle started to turn, decided that they were done. They had been called up for 90 days service, and those 90 days were nearly up, and they were not necessarily willing to lie down and die so close to the end of their time in the Army. But Marr would go on to be promoted to colonel and would gain international recognition and fame as the commander of the Irish Brigade, of which the veterans of the 69th New York Militia would play a substantial role. So yeah, no missing nose or mustache as far as I can find, but I would be delighted if someone who knew more about his face could prove me wrong. In other war news, we get the report about the Union defeat at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri. Great slaughter on both sides. General Lyon killed. Generals McCulloch and Price reported killed. Union forces retreat in good order. Now this one I actually have a picture for. There it is. Wilson's Creek was the first major battle of the Trans-Mississippi Theater. It was the result of a few weeks of maneuvering between General Nathaniel Lyon's U.S. Army of the West, which was facing off against a combined Confederate force, General McCulloch's Western Army, mostly soldiers from Arkansas with some Louisianans and Texas cavalry, alongside General Sterling Pappy Price, commanding the Missouri State Guard, a pro-secessionist militia raised in Missouri. And the situation in Missouri is complicated. It had taken part heavily in the violence that took place in Kansas the previous decade, and the state held large numbers of pro-slavery supporters. When the war breaks out, the state tries to pull a Kentucky and basically declares itself neutral, which isn't how statehood works in this country, but still. The problem was that the governor, Claiborne Jackson, was very pro-Confederate. And he was in communication with the Davis administration about securing Missouri for the Confederacy. Jackson organized the Missouri Volunteer Militia as a peacekeeping force, ostensibly, but was secretly planning to use them to seize the federal arsenal in St. Louis, which at the time was the fourth largest repository of small arms in the nation. There were upwards of 38,000 muskets and rifles there. Back in April, a pro-secessionist mob had already raided the Liberty Arsenal and made off with about 1,000 muskets, so this would be a huge score. Fortunately, the U.S. officer in temporary command of the department, Captain Nathaniel Lyon, was paying attention. After the raid in Liberty, he began recruiting loyal Missourians into U.S. service. So, when Governor Jackson's militia was drilling outside St. Louis, Lyon had the U.S. soldiers under his command surround them. The militia surrendered without incident, but later, when the soldiers were escorting the militiamen into St. Louis, an angry crowd began to harass the column of federal troops. In what is known as the Camp Jackson Affair, U.S. soldiers shot and killed some 30 civilians and wounded another 90. Lyon's actions made national news, and a few short weeks later would be promoted to brigadier general and given overall command of all U.S. forces in the state. Now, look, that's not without some controversy, especially since his actions very likely secured Missouri for the U.S. by thwarting Jackson's arsenal grab scheme. But the death of civilians at the hands of U.S. soldiers should not be lightly excused either. Fast forward to August, Lyon's men are hoping to drive McCulloch and Price from the state. The U.S. has effective control of all but the southwestern quarter of Missouri, and Lyon believes that his smaller but better equipped force of 5,400 will be equal to the task of routing the larger Confederate armies, combined total of some 11,000. So the numbers in the paper are a bit exaggerated, roughly times 2. I actually highly doubt you could have found 23,000 rebels under arms in the entire state, let alone at Wilson's Creek. And what follows in the paper is a report submitted by Major General Fremont, who's commanding the Western Department of which Missouri was part. The paper, it's very hard to read, but a copy of the report is available elsewhere, so here we have. General Fremont's report, Headquarters, Western Department, St. Louis, August 13th, 1861. Colonel E.D. Townsend. General Lyon, in 3 columns under himself, Sigel, and Sturgis, attacked the enemy at 6:30 in the morning of the 10th instant, 9 miles southeast of Springfield. The engagement was severe. Our loss is about 800 killed and wounded. General Lyon was killed in a charge at the head of his column. Our force was 8,000, including 2,000 home guards. The muster roll reported to have been taken from the enemy gives their force at 23,000, including regiments from Louisiana, Tennessee, and Mississippi, with Texas Rangers and Cherokee half-breeds. This statement is corroborated by prisoners. The enemy's loss is reported to have been heavy, including Generals McCulloch and Price. Their tents and wagons were all destroyed in the action. General Sigel left 1 gun on the field and retreated to Springfield, where, at 3:00 in the morning of the 11th, he continued his retreat upon Rolla, bringing off his baggage trains and $250,000 in specie from the Springfield Bank. J.C. Fremont, Major General Commanding. Okay, so a couple of things. First, neither Price nor McCulloch were killed in the battle. 2, The casualties for each side were roughly the same. It was about 1,300 for the US and 1,200 for the Confederates. But given the unequal size of the opposing armies, that is a drastic difference in the casualty rate. The US suffered 1 dead for every 19 soldiers, whereas the Confederates only lost 1 man per 43. All told, 1 in 5 US soldiers were either killed, wounded, or captured. That's a stinging blow. And the battle started out so well, too. The US forces overran the rebel camps and set up strong defensive positions, but the rebels counterattacked repeatedly. Most of those attacks failed due to the poor quality of the Missouri militia, lack of sufficient ammunition, as well as just poor coordination between the two principal Confederate commanders. McCulloch and Price did not get along. And did not think well of each other. McCulloch had a very dim opinion of the Missouri soldiers' qualities. And so that really worked against them. Lyon himself was shot and killed at roughly 9:30 in the morning. Now, he had already been wounded in the leg and head and was on his second horse of the day. The first had already been shot out from under him, when he was shot through the heart by pro-Southern forces of the 2nd Kansas Infantry. He was the first U.S. officer of general grade to be killed in the war. He's the first of 46. Now, interestingly, he had a monument to him in St. Louis at the university's campus, which stood from 1929 until 1960. When it was removed at the request of a descendant of a Confederate general. Harriet Frost Fordyce is the daughter of General Frost, the general who surrendered the drilling militia to Lyon at Camp Jackson. Fordyce agreed to leave more than $1 million to the university in her will, on the condition that Lyon's memorial, basically his statue, his dedication, be moved. I know that monument removal and renamings have been in the news a lot lately, but this is not the first time that we are dealing with this or having these conversations, and nor is it limited merely to academics or Northerners who are somehow trying to erase Southern history. Fordyce was a prominent member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and not only did she successfully get Lyon's dedication taken away from the campus, but in honor of the gift that she left, they named that campus the Frost Campus. And that name was only changed in like 2017. When students of St. Louis University looked into, like, oh, where does that name come from? Oh, he was a Confederate general, and kind of said, we don't like that. And it's today known as North Campus. So again, this is not something new. These things are fluid. They're changing across time and space. But I couldn't believe that we get this report in the Schenectady Democrat and Reflector about his death. And it has direct connections to things that are going on right now. Ongoing conversations about the legacy of this war and how we remember it, and what communities decide they want to name things after. It's all fascinating to me. It's so connected. Now, as far as the consequence of the battle itself, it's largely an empty victory for the Confederacy. Their forces are too tired and too low on supplies to realistically pursue the retreating U.S. forces. Price kind of wanted to, but he didn't have the equipment. McCulloch didn't want to because he was worried about stretching his supply lines from Arkansas too thin. And as it is, McCulloch ended up withdrawing from the state anyway for the safety of Arkansas, leaving Price and his Missouri Guard to their own devices. Price would go on and campaign throughout the state and be a general nuisance, but even with renewed Confederate support in the form of Earl Van Dorn, who sent out west by Jefferson Davis to take overall command and try and coordinate efforts to secure Missouri, they're ultimately going to fail. They never successfully wrest Missouri away from U.S. control. And a big part of that is because of Lyon's actions early. So an interesting but controversial figure. Now, in lighter news, the advertisements page has this fantastic bit. The Patriot Jackson said, "The Union must be preserved." And Samuel Myers says, "He can sell the best goods at the lowest prices. He has received a new stock of gold and silver watches and rich jewelry." Samuel Myers was a jeweler and importer in New York City. He actually had trade catalogs and whatnot. The company itself seems to disappear, probably goes defunct around the 1910s or 20s. But if you have any jewelry from the second, say, half of the 19th century, maybe a clock, and if you have the initials SFM Company, that's them. And I absolutely love this. So what they're referring to here, and I think this is just the weirdest way to sell jewelry, is a famous exchange between President Andrew Jackson and his own vice president, John C. Calhoun. So in 1830, the Nullification Crisis is burning hot. South Carolina is throwing a tantrum because a tariff that they had had a hand in creating, the so-called Tariff of Abominations, was still on the books. Now, this tariff was a relic of the John Quincy Adams administration. Southerners had expected Jackson to take action against it when he came into office, but we're now 2 years into his term. It's the 1830, and he's not really touching it. Instead, Jackson is using the revenue that's being generated by this tariff to do things like pay down the federal debt. He's putting that money to work and shows no sign of taking any sort of major legislative action or urgency on coming up with a newer, better tariff for Southern interests. And so there's some grumblings within the National Democratic Party. Southern Dems don't like this, but Northern Dems did. And there's Jackson in the mix, a Southerner, a slaveholder, and a vocal supporter of states' rights, but within the federal union. And that's the key. Now, Calhoun was a rising star in national politics, but was also a strong supporter of South Carolina. And he had anonymously penned this letter back in 28, in which he declared that states could nullify federal laws with which they disagreed. They can't. That's completely bogus. That's totally made up. But here's the thing. Calhoun is basing this on the old Virginia and Kentucky resolution. So now we're going back to the first Adams administration, John Adams, when Thomas Jefferson, right, another vice president who disagrees with his own administration, is secretly penning these resolutions along with guys like Madison in opposition to Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts. Wow. So yes, the Adams administration's Alien and Sedition Acts, which were problematic, let's be clear, right? Well, the story breaks that Calhoun wrote this letter, right, that states can nullify federal laws, drawing on the old compact theory out of Jefferson, and Jackson takes this personally. Right? He sees himself as the safeguard of states' rights within the federal union. So this is a personal attack as far as he's concerned. And it's coming from within his own house. Calhoun is vice president. And before this was likely en route to being our next president. There is an alternate reality out there where Calhoun is president after Jackson. But in part due to his involvement of the Petticoat affair, I mean, it's not entirely due to that, but that didn't help. Calhoun is going to find himself largely shunned from Jackson's inner circle and will be relegated to a regional superstar. I mean, he's still a titan in American politics in this era, but at one time he's on track to be the next national figure, and he'll largely just become a Southern states' rights advocate, being opposed by guys like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. Martin Van Buren will rise when Calhoun falls. And here's the thing. Look, many Southern members of the Democratic Party had been kind of expecting Jackson to fall into line and support the pro-nullification arguments of Calhoun because of himself, right? Like, he's a wealthy guy, but he's largely self-made. He's a slaveholder, but he seems to have some disdain for slaveholding aristocracy, right? Because he made his own wealth through slaves, but wasn't necessarily inherited, and he's such a complicated figure, and we could spend the rest of our time talking about Jackson's legacy, right? It is contentious. But above all here, as far as this is concerned, he is a nationalist. He believes in the power of the federal government, and he vehemently disagrees with nullification, or the notion that states are supreme over the federal government. And Jackson's right. So, and here's where the Jefferson connection comes in. In 1830, Jackson gets wind of the fact that members of his own party are going to try and present this unified front on this issue. Nonetheless, at a birthday celebration for Jefferson. This was kind of an annual tradition. And members of the administration are going to be there. There's like 3 cabinet members who are going to be there, top-ranking officials in the National Democratic Party, etc., etc. And he finds out that they're basically going to sandbag him with all these pro-nullification speeches and toasts, and kind of like catch him off guard and get him to go along with the party line, because so far he hasn't really taken a big public stance on this issue. And that's driving some people crazy. And so Jackson finds out about this and goes. And I love this because it's so awkward. I love everything about this because it's so incredibly uncomfortable. So first up, we get some speeches that are making it very clear that they're not there to celebrate Jefferson as much as they are to claim Jefferson as an ally, right? The spiritual forefather to nullification. By linking him via the compact theory to Calhoun, and from Calhoun to nullification. And reportedly, according to some of the newspapers, there were people who left in disgust. Like, a number of people got up and left, but not the president. Jackson stays, and when it comes time, he stands up and he offers his toast, and he's just like staring directly into Calhoun's soul, and he says, "Our Union, it must be preserved." Record scratch. Like, brings the whole place to a halt and makes abundantly clear his position. No to nullification, right? U.S. law reigns supreme. The federal government reigns supreme. You don't get to just pick and choose which laws you want to follow. So Calhoun, I mean, look, he's not someone to be bullied or cowed into submission. I mean, he is a national figure, right? He fires right back. He stands right up for his own toast. The Union, next to our liberties, the most dear. You can just feel like Jackson just like digging his fingers into the table. It's so awkward. Basically, Martin Van Buren gets up next and he like offers this really feeble, like, "Oh, compromise is great." Like, it's just super, it's like, everyone there is so uncomfortable. And look, this whole situation, it burns hot and then it snuffs out, right? The nullification question is eventually settled by a compromise tariff designed by Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Clay and Calhoun worked this one out. But that's 1833. But that's after Jackson had made clear his intention to use the U.S. Army and Navy to force South Carolina to obey federal law. Right? He has a force bill go through Congress where he is going to use the Army and the Navy to collect the tariff if South Carolina won't. And holy cow, right? That's a massive use of federal power. And here we are, 28 years later, in a civil war, and you have a merchant in New York using that same rhetoric, right, to advertise. We have an actual civil war. The Union must be preserved. Jackson said it, so why not buy watches and jewelry from me? I love everything about this. It's so good. It's so weird, but it's so good. It's fantastic. I absolutely love it. Now, I'd like to close with a couple of interesting pieces, and that is foreign news, because there's a whole section here on news from Europe. And look, the page 2 of this paper is actually quite fascinating. Cyrus Thayer's editorial is all about the state democratic convention, and in fact, most of the news on page 2 is about that. The problem is that this particular issue is in really poor condition, and most of page 2 is largely unreadable, which is a real shame because I would love to know what exactly Thayer and other Democrats in the state are saying. Because remember, 61, you had a special Senate election, and a Republican wins. But the following year, Democrats are going to sweep the gubernatorial elections. And the guy who's losing in the 61 Senate race will win the governor's mansion in 62. And we'll get to there, I'm sure. I'm sure this Democrat and Reflector will have things to say about that. But I'd love to know what the convention is doing a year out. And unfortunately, just the primary source isn't there. If someone else has a better copy of this issue, I would love to see it. But alas, the version that's been digitized is in real rough shape. So, all right, foreign news. First off, the Roman question, which is fascinating to see this come up in print. And they are talking about what is going on with the question of what to do with Vatican City and the city of Rome. So the Paris correspondent of the Times says it was currently believed that a solution of the Rome question was near at hand. It is affirmed that such really was the case, that the papal government had supplied arms to Naples' insurrectionists. The emperor to postpone the solution no longer. The solution is expected. It is the evacuation of the Roman territory by the French and its occupation by Italian troops. So here's the very quick background, because I'm not a European historian, and this does fall outside the purview of what I'm doing here, but it's also so cool, and it is big international news, that I loved seeing it in this local paper. The long and short of it was that the 1860s unification wars that create the Kingdom of Italy, nobody was quite sure what to do with the papacy. Right? Historically, the Holy See and the Vatican had commanded multiple cities, sizable stretches of territory, they'd fielded armies, etc. But during the unification struggles and the creation of the Kingdom of Italy, Rome was occupied and then reoccupied, and at present, there's a French garrison that holds the city, and they're there basically protecting the Pope, Pope Pius IX. When the Kingdom of Italy was created, and look, it's like 8 seconds old at this point, it's brand new, they had proclaimed Rome as the new capital, but they couldn't occupy it. And so this was sort of the ongoing question of Europe and greater Christendom, particularly Catholics, was what happens to the Pope in Rome, right? Like, if Italians control the city, I mean, does the Pope still an independent being in that sense? Is he subject to the king's authority, right? The king of Italy? How does that work? And so it's really kind of fascinating here that you had this moment where they were like, oh, okay, it seems like the French are going to withdraw and turn the city over to Italy. They don't. In fact, the French will remain until the Franco-Prussian War breaks out in like 1870. So it's another 9 years after this report. But still, they can't know that. The optimism for a negotiated settlement is high. And even after the Franco-Prussian War, the Rome question persists into the 20th century. I mean, it's not till you get basically fascist Italy that you have the creation of the modern Vatican as we understand it. So it's this decades-long affair in Europe, and I'm not doing it justice here because it is fascinating, and it captured people's attention, and it has to do with sovereignty and national boundaries and this fun era of nation-state building, fun for some. But the question was like, what do you do with the Pope? And here they are talking about it, 1861. Now, one area where the optimism is not so high is the following report about communication between Britain and France. I'll read this to you. The British government just now is in intimate correspondence with the French cabinet in order that united action may be observed towards America by sea and land. As a real conflict is now expected, a perfect understanding is likely to be arrived at. So look, Europe is the wild card in the Civil War. And European involvement, mainly in the form of British and French armies and navies siding with the Confederacy, shows up in a lot of fiction. It's usually there as an option in video games and board games. It plays a huge role in counterfactual what-ifs. All right, like, what if Gettysburg, but Lee has like 45,000 extra French troops? Like, what the hell? Okay, sure, why not? Now, we know historically they don't intervene. But at the time, it's something the Lincoln administration is watching very closely. It's something the Davis administration is watching very closely. And trying to make sense of this largely boils down to basically cotton for a lot of people, which is a shame because it's much more involved than that. France, we know, was more eager to get involved, and not necessarily because they were pro-Confederate in any meaningful sense. For them, it was largely an opportunity to keep the U.S. divided and distracted so that we couldn't enforce the Monroe Doctrine. France had dreams of empire. They wanted to rebuild their Western Empire that had largely been lost ever since Napoleon the First. And to do so, they want to play around in Mexico, right? The French have visions of installing a puppet dictator on the throne of Mexico. And to do that, they want the U.S. to be distracted. So for some, right, the French government are kind of interested in like, yeah, like let's help the Confederacy out. Britain, incidentally, is actually way less interested in getting involved. You know, both Britain and France do grant belligerent status to the Confederacy. That's not the same thing as recognizing them as a sovereign state. It's basically a way to acknowledge, like, yes, we get that you are a group that claims you're separate and are fighting, but no foreign government actually recognized the Confederacy as legitimate. And that matters, right? Nationhood is a club, and it's basically only upon the recognition from others that you get in. But Britain is having to weigh a lot of things. And look, Britain is heavily industrialized, and a lot of that is geared towards manufacturing textiles. Textiles are the most important industry in this century. It's global, and they make a lot of money off of it. And they are used to cheap imports of U.S. cotton. But here's a couple things that they're having to also weigh. One, wars are costly. Yes, the United States tends to keep a small standing army and a small navy, but that does not mean that it cannot defend itself and won't fight back if Britain gets involved. Two, Britain already had cotton. Britain had a ton of cotton, literally. The previous year's crops had been really good, and so British warehouses were stuffed to the gills with cotton. And so when the war starts and everyone starts wondering, like, oh gosh, like what's going to happen to the cotton supply? Not everyone clutched their pearls and collapsed like, oh, this is the end of Britain as we know it. They were fine. They had already bought plenty of cotton. Some estimates suggest that Britain could have run its factories without any new imports for between 8 months and a year. So that's a long time to be able to sort of, like, is this really going to be a thing? Like, let's ride this out and see. Third, cotton is not Britain's only import. And that matters. For somehow this seems to slip people's minds when they want to talk about, like, King Cotton. Yes, cotton exports for the US made a lot of money, but we also exported a ton of stuff that wasn't cotton, like food. Britain and mainland Europe import a ton of US foodstuffs, thanks to things like the market revolution that had broken open whole new areas for agricultural production, right? Rochester is the wheat capital of New York, because they're just producing tons of it and putting it on the Erie Canal, sending it down to New York City, and then boom, it's across the Atlantic. Londoners wake up in the morning and they go to work because they've eaten American bread. The John Deere plow with its steel tip and the McCormick Reaper are turning the Great Plains into a breadbasket. Corn is king was the Northern rallying slogan, right? Corn is king. Never mind cotton. And so, yes, look, I don't want to say that cotton wasn't important, because of course it was. And Britain did import a ton of it. But they had other favorable trade deals with the US that they had to consider. British merchants and industrialists had made huge investments in the US economy. Railroads, banking, heavy mining. I mean, you go out west, right? Mining for gold in places like California is not an old prospector with a pan, sifting things. It's European-built machines designed to blast away tons of rock to get to precious metal ore. And a lot of them are financed by European banks. You go to war, those investments are at risk. They could be seized. At the very least, they could be frozen. Right? You might be shut out of access to your own company's investments for years. At the end of the day, Britain and France don't get involved, and it's part of that consideration, right? Yes, you can point to adept diplomacy on the part of the Lincoln administration and foreign diplomats. You can point it to the horribleness of Confederate diplomats at securing for their side the support of foreign governments. A whole host of things. The Lincoln issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, which turns Antietam into the anti-Saratoga and keeps Europe out by making the war a moral contest over an institution that both Britain and France had turned their back on, in some cases, decades prior. But at the end of the day, money talks. And Britain is buying a ton of food from the US, and that has to factor in. So I love this because, again, right, it's 61. It's August of 61. No one yet knows if Britain is going to join. No one knows if the Royal Navy is going to get involved, because if it does, holy cow, right, that is a game changer. But we know that they don't, and that's part of it. Corn is king. All right. Well, this has been the Civil War on paper for August 15th, 1861. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please remember to like and subscribe so you can get these videos as they're uploaded. And as always, read more history. Have a great night.